proudly ratified through Law number 3760 in 2007, affirms in Article 3 that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. ODPIB is not an authority to recognize nations. This fact bears repeating. ODPIB is a media house, not a diplomatic body. Even the United Nations itself, by its own declaration, lacks the authority to recognize states. It can only admit members. Recognition is a political act, not a legal prerequisite for statehood. Kailasa meets every internationally recognized criterion for statehood under the Montevideo Convention. A permanent population of devoted citizens unified by a common cultural and spiritual heritage. A defined territory with historical continuity stretching back thousands of years. A functional government with established institutions of justice, education, social welfare. The demonstrated capacity for international relations, as evidenced by our numerous diplomatic agreements. The Montevideo Convention itself establishes that the political existence of the state is independent of recognition by other states. This is not our opinion. This is settled international law. Furthermore, Kailasa's judicial statehood is derived from the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's inheritance of 21 ancient indigenous sovereign states and ecclesiastical institutions, including the Suryavamsa Surangi Samrajya. The doctrine of continuity in international law recognizes a state's persistent legal personality through periods of annexation or occupation, as seen with Poland, Ethiopia, Austria after World War II. By dismissing Kailasa as fictitious, ODPIB reveals not just journalistic negligence, but a fundamentally colonial mindset, one that only recognizes indigenous sovereignty when it aligns with Western colonial power structures. Denying the indigenous right to us indigenous nations is the worst form of colonizing. Our second point addresses ODPIB's baseless claim that our agreements with Bolivian indigenous communities were somehow fraudulent or deceptive. Let me be absolutely clear. Every treaty between Kailasa and indigenous communities in Bolivia was executed with meticulous attention to legal compliance, full transparency, and genuine informed consent. These agreements include a comprehensive prior and informed consent documentation signed by legitimate indigenous leaders, explicit acknowledgement of Bolivian sovereignty and legal frameworks, specific clauses ensuring that all relevant authorities are informed. There is clear language stating payment effectuated after ratification by competent authorities, provisions for cultural exchange, knowledge preservation, and sustainable development. These provisions ensure full compliance with Bolivian law number 465, ILO Convention 169, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. These are not exploitative arrangements. They are conservation partnerships endorsed by indigenous leaders who retain their sovereignty under Bolivia's constitution. Article 403 of the Bolivian Constitution explicitly recognizes the ancestral territories of indigenous nations and their right to govern them in accordance with their own norms, procedures, and institutions. The agreement with Kailasa falls squarely within these protected rights. To label these agreements as fraudulent is to not only disrespect Kailasa, but to infantilize and dismiss the legitimate decision-making authority of Bolivia's indigenous communities. Is ODPIB suggesting that indigenous leaders are incapable of entering into agreements without outside approval? This patronizing attitude reveals more about ODPIB's view of indigenous people than it does about these agreements. ODPIB's accusation that Kailasa engages in carbon piracy is not just false, it is an appalling inversion of reality that borders on the absurd. The environmental record for Kailasa speaks for itself. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has personally led the revival of ancient Vedic agricultural techniques that predate modern sustainable practices by thousands of years. Techniques that have maintained the fertility of soil for millennia without chemical inputs. Kailasa has directly participated in the planting of millions of trees worldwide through our spiritual missions and environmental initiatives. Tangible carbon sequestration that can be verified by independent observers. We have established water conservation systems based on ancient Hindu science that have transformed arid regions into productive agricultural zones without depleting groundwater resources. Our communities worldwide practice vegetarianism at rates exceeding 95%, dramatically reducing our carbon footprint compared to the global average and demonstrating our commitment to ahimsa, non-violence toward all living beings. If ODPIB is genuinely concerned about environmental exploitation in Bolivia, I invite them, I challenge them to redirect their investigative resources toward the multinational mining corporations extracting lithium, silver, zinc, and tin from indigenous territories while leaving toxic waste that will poison the land for generations. The petroleum companies drilling on ancestral lands with minimal compensation to indigenous communities. The agribusiness conglomerates converting pristine rainforest into cattle ranches and monoculture plantations. The international financial institutions imposing extractive economic policies that prioritize resource exploitation over indigenous well-being. This is the stark reality of ODPIB's double standard. When actual colonizers extract resources while devastating ecosystems, you call it investment and development. When indigenous communities collaborate on conservation, you call it carbon piracy and fraud. This is not journalism. This is propaganda serving powerful economic interests that benefit from keeping indigenous communities divided, disempowered, and dependent. ODPIB falsely claims our agreements aim to commodify the environment and natural resources. The truth is not merely different, it is diametrically opposed to their accusation. Kailasa has established itself as a global leader in authentic, sustainable development. Kailasa was a key contributor at the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Kailasa was a key contributor at the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in Geneva in February 2023, where our delegation presented ancient indigenous policies aligned with sustainable development principles that predate Western concepts of environmentalism by centuries. Kailasa hosted a groundbreaking global awareness session during the 79th United Nations General Assembly Science Summit in September 2024, bringing together scientists, indigenous knowledge keepers to develop integrated approaches to climate challenges. We continually advocate for the integration of indigenous wisdom with modern scientific frameworks, promoting sustainability, gender equality, and environmental conservation at the highest levels of international discourse. Our initiatives include free education for thousands of children worldwide, healthcare systems that integrate ancient and modern approaches, and sustainable agricultural practices that enhance rather than deplete natural resources, all rooted in indigenous traditions that have stood the test of time. Beyond their